Good afternoon, YouTube. Um, I just wanted to quickly clarify a couple of things on this story from Rebel News um, on the Wet'suwet'en chief Woos, aka Frank Alec, who stole the title from a young lady, I believe. The title itself as chief can only be held by a woman within the tribe, so to speak. And it sounds like, from what I'm hearing all over YouTube from Rebel, that Wu stole the title from the young lady because she didn't agree with his policy on the pipeline, which was don't build the pipeline and keep the construction project off Wet'suwet'en territory. So the radicalist approach. And she was more or less inclined to support the pipeline going through. Uh, Upon closer examination of the Wet'suwet'en, I now can conclude that there are two factions. One is the Wet'suwet'en tribe that has they do approve the pipeline. You could say the hereditary chief or whatnot. But correct me if I'm wrong. But I heard that about a year ago there was a rebel news media done by, I think, Keenan Bexty, but it might have been also Ezra Levant. Anyhow, they explained concisely how there were two factions. So the Wet'suwet'en nation itself, and then there's a branch of it, or a second faction that is actually a company, Wet'suwet'en, or they're working for a company. And that company is inclined as a radical environmental extremist. And that's the faction that sort of morphed into the extremism that's taken over now. So, as I understand it, this Chief Woos that Ezra is about to go on about, Frank Alec has no authority to negotiate, for starters. Chief Woos, the so-called Chief Woos, that's a title, not a name. Both those words. So, Frank Alec is essentially usurped the position from a young lady whom there is a line of succession, you could say, that only a woman is allowed to hold that position of chief. So I can't impress that enough. He has no authority. Frank Alec has no authority to negotiate on behalf of Wet'suwet'en. Now, if he has authority, he's taken it by force and without consensus, you could say. So when I started to examine it, it appears that Wet'suwet'en, that group from which stems forth as an environmental extremist, green radicals, they are but a small minority, you could say, a faction inside Wet'suwet'en. And they may stand apart. It may be the same name, but they stand apart in motivation. So I looked at the situation and I said, Wet'suwet'en even themselves claim that if the pipeline doesn't go through, it will mean severe economic, not decline, but let's call it, they need that money. There's going to be at least a $10 million payout annually to the Wet'suwet'en tribe, according to what I've read. And that money is invaluable to the prosperity and the growth of those people, of that tribe. So they need that money, ergo, they need the pipeline to go through because it will be economically beneficial in more than just the pipeline passing through. So essentially, the ones that aren't radicalized have already sided with the other tribes that approved the pipeline to go through. And since there's already a pipeline in place there and it's just following the same route, more or less, then, everything else is political. So I just wanted to clarify the faction of Wet'suwet'en that is attacking the trains and other things. I can more or less verify that they hold the name Wet'suwet'en, but they're not Wet'suwet'en tribes people. They are a faction. They may have some blood Wet'suwet'en, maybe not. What I'm discovering more and more is that faction is actually a company. It's a company being paid to essentially create the problem. So if I go and I analyze it further, really the indigenous peoples that live in that area, the tribes, have pretty much unanimous support. I think 14 out of the 15 tribes, Wet'suwet'en not included, for some political reason or another, but I think that's the reason. That the smaller but the radicalized faction, you could say, of that tribe, which is not really their tribe, but it's a faction paid for by that company and led by this Chief Woos, create the problem, and create a serious problem at that they don't really represent the Wet'suwet'en nation. They don't. Chief Woos has no authority. Frank Alec has no authority, and yet he's the guy that our government is negotiating with, and he has no authority. What I really, and I have to apologize to my viewers because I keep going to Rebel for basically all my content, and I don't want to do that so much. But the one thing you have to keep in mind is that Rebel is not as biased as the rest of them. I would say they're not at all biased, but you can never take it to that extreme. Every media company has some bias. But what I'm trying to say is that Rebel itself is the only media outlet that's really going after the situation and trying to cover it. So I would say in the media, the news that needs to be reported on Wet'suwet'en and the blockades, I'd say they're impartial. They're not biased. So, because they're representing the other point of view which is being suppressed, right? So you can't go on CTV and definitely not CBC to get the truth out of them, because they'll suppress everything and everybody knows it. At least anybody who's unbiased knows, and who studied the CBC knows they're extremely biased in favor of the Liberal Party. So one has to be, I don't want to say we can pick and choose, but we have to pick and choose which we're going to use to represent the truth. And I'm thinking that Ezra and Keenan Bexte and Dave Menzies is really, they're pushing hard to expose the story. The lady, Sheila Gunn Reid, they all of them are trying to expose the story and try to more or less peer past the facade. And when I look at how all of the protesters, about 90, actually, yes, most of them, about 90% of them are masks when they're attacking the train and so on, to conceal their identity. I would argue these people are not only far removed from the Wet'suwet'en nation, they're using the Wet'suwet'en as a guise to attack the entire system of Canada. But they themselves, if they share blood, it's a marginal fraction. They are not pure from what you would call a Wet'suwet'en family line. So I do believe that this company, and I'll show you the clip later on in another video, because I have to track it down again. It's about a year old, where they divide the Wet'suwet'en into two groups. And it's very important. That distinction proves to me that faction is some kind of foreign sponsor of terrorism in Canada. That person behind that group is paying them to create chaos in Canada, and essentially to stop any pipeline building and whatnot. I mean, it's government incompetence. And of course, I can say that there are money at the back of Trudeau as well, donating to the Trudeau Foundation to get him to turn a blind eye. But perhaps he never liked us in the first place, and Trudeau is actually resolved to stand with those enemies of Canada. So I have many theories about it, but I wanted to make a quick video about that because Frank Alec, who is responsible for negotiating, and seems to me that has a great deal of power or regard as a negotiator for the federal government, has no authority to negotiate on behalf of the Wet'suwet'en. Thank you for your time and your attention. I appreciate if you would like, subscribe, and comment very much. I would appreciate that. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.